So from this we've understood that Allah has names and attributes that are unique to Him. And therefore we must single out Allah Azza wa Jal in those names and attributes. Now here comes an interesting mas'ala or interesting question, which is what is the difference then between Tawhid al-Rububiyyah and Tawhid al-Asma wa Sifat when we want to make a difference? Why did I say when we want to make a difference? Because we can join them both together. We can lump them both together and we can call it Tawhid al-Ma'rifati wal-Ithbat, the Tawheed of knowing Allah and affirming who Allah is and what Allah does. But if we wanted to separate and someone said, okay, you've put these three categories, you've showed us that the Quran has these three categories. Tell me what is really the difference between al-Rububiyyah and al-Asma wa Sifat when we're trying to make a difference between them. So there's definitely an overlap, no doubt about it. But remember, another way of explaining al-Rububiyyah is to single out Allah in His actions. So Rububiyyah is all about Allah's actions. Does that make sense? Rububiyyah revolves around Allah's actions. What Allah does. In other words, nobody does what Allah does except Him. Now, no doubt those actions come from His names and attributes in the sense that there are names and attributes, and some of those names and attributes have associated actions with them. So those have come from there. But if we wanted to separate, then the focus of Tawheed al-Rububiyyah is on the actions of Allah Azza wa Jal, and the focus of Tawheed al-Asma wa Sifat is upon the names and the attributes themselves. However, in Tawheed al-Asma wa Sifat, we are going to cover that the names and attributes which indicate an action, we also affirm the action, and that action is going to be what we talk about in Tawheed al-Rububiyyah. So there is a clear overlap between the two, and that's why you can lump them together as one if you prefer, or you can separate between them if you prefer. And there is no right or wrong way of doing that. I'll give you an example. I don't know if this example, I was thinking about this example. I don't know if it makes sense, but I'll see if it makes sense to you. Let's say that I have in my hand, just for an example, I have some counters, you know, the plastic counters. Some of them are transparent, clear. Some of them are red and some of them are blue. You with me so far? So I picked up a bag full of counters or a handful of counters. Some of them are transparent, some of them are red, and some of them are blue. It's possible for a person, if I say to them, categorize what's in my hand. One person says, you've got three types of counters. Clear ones, transparent ones, red ones, and blue ones. Another person says, you've got two types of counters, transparent and opaque. You've got some that are see-through and some that are not see-through. Those two are not, neither of them are wrong. They're just, each of them is looking at it in a particular way. Now, here comes the most important point. What happens, and I don't know if this is stretching the example a bit, but I want to try and put something across to you. It might be stretching the example a bit. What happens if someone comes along who's colorblind, says, I can't see any difference between red and blue. I can only see red. I can't see any blue counters. At that point, would you not emphasize to them, no, there are three types of counters here, guys. There are clear counters and red ones and blue ones. Because the person couldn't see that there were three different types. But if a person never had that issue in the first place, you might suffice yourself and say that there are clear and opaque. That's enough for me. So what I wanted to convey to you is, why is it that sometimes people mention al-Asma wa Sifat and sometimes people suffice with al-Ma'rifah wal-Ithbat? Because it depends on whether there is something which is being denied or being misunderstood here. And some people, I want to also make it clear that I'm not saying that the three, Tawheed divided into three, I'm not saying that Tawheed divided into three is something which was added later on. That's not true. That's actually it's an inaccurate statement to say that the third category of Tawheed was added on later. It wasn't, رَبُّ السَّمَاوَاتِ وَالْأَرْضِ وَمَا بَيْنَهُمَا فَاعْبُدْهُ وَاصْطَبِرْ لِعِبَادَتِهِ هَلْ تَعْلَمُ لَهُ سَمِيًّا الْحَمْدُ لِلَّهِ رَبِّ الْعَالَمِينَ. It wasn't added on later on. But there are people who sought to emphasize and others who said, it's sufficient. People know al-ma'rifah wal-ithbat. I know Allah's names and attributes and actions. And some people thought, no, I'm going to separate. Now the question is, does the Quran separate between them? Yes. Sometimes the Quran separates between them. So here there is no issue with that. And I wanted that issue or that matter to be clear. So now comes the next issue here. And that is that Tawhid al-Asma wa Sifat, and I've mentioned this already, is going to lead you to Tawhid al-Uluhiyah. Don't think that it is mujarrad ma'rifah. It's just, I just have to know these names and that's it. So we're going back to Taqsim at-Tawhid. If you want to learn a little bit more about the division of Tawhid, I know Sheikh Sadiq mentioned to you quite a bit. And he mentioned that it's reported from a number of famous scholars of Islam. I think perhaps the most famous in the beginning is Imam Abu Hanifa, rahimahullah ta'ala. For example, in his statement, Wallahu yuda'a min a'la la min asfal. He said, inna asfal, or he said, idil asfal laysa min wasf al-rububiyyah wal-uluhiyyah fi shay'aw kama qal. Close to that. I'm just reading it by memory, but it's close to that. He said, Allah is called upon above, not below, because lowliness has got nothing to do with rububiyyah and uluhiyyah at all. Now, in case you thought that isn't related to Tawheed, because he mentions, how many types of Tawheed does Imam Abu Hanifa mention in that quote? And Asma wa Sifat, he said, Wallahu yuda'a min a'la la min asfal. And he said Allah is called upon in highness. That's his sifa, right? Sifat al-ulu. Ithbat al-ulu sifatan lillahi azza wa jal. So, but he talks about al-uluhiyyah or rububiyyah. In case someone might think that we're taking the kalam of the Imam Abu Hanifa and we are, maybe trying to get a bit more out of it than is in there, then go back to what Sheikh Sadiq told you about Imam al-Tahawi. Whose aqeedah is Imam al-Tahawi quoting? This is the aqeedah of who? Abu Hanifa and Abu Yusuf and Muhammad ibn al-Hasan. He says that right at the beginning of his aqeedah Tahawiyah, that this aqeedah of mine is a truthful rendition of the aqeedah of Abu Hanifa and Abu Yusuf and Muhammad ibn al-Hasan. What does he say in the beginning? نقول في توحيد الله معتقدين بتوفيق الله إن الله واحد لا شريك له ولا شيء مثله ولا شيء يعجز ولا إله غيره, as he says. So here, he specifically says this is Abu Hanifa's belief about the Tawheed of Allah Azza wa Jal. On that point, a person might raise an issue. This is going back a little bit, but it just came to my mind. Someone might say, I'm not even going to argue with you about this Tawheed al-Asma wa Sifat, and I'm going to say this word Tawheed, where did it come from? Like, in the word Tawheed itself is used in some of the narrations. You can find it. Like in the narration of the hadith of Mu'adh ibn Jabal, when the Prophet ﷺ sent him to Yemen to give da'wah to Ahl Kitab. And in one of the narrations, وَفِي رِوَايَةٍ, he said to him, فَلْيَكُنْ أَوَّلَ مَا تَدْعُوهُمْ إِلَيْهِ أَنْ يُوَحِّدُوا اللَّهِ. Let the first thing you call them to be the Tawheed of Allah. Even if you say that is riwayah bil ma'na, it's being narrated by meaning, it still shows that that word, La ilaha illallah, and the Shahadatain and Tawheed of Allah were synonymous in the time of the early generations. Yani when the narrators were narrating the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ before the time of Imam al-Bukhari, in the golden generations of Islam, those words were synonymous. Yani La ilaha illallah and Tawheed, and they used them, they swapped them out. So some of the narrations say, أن يوحدوا الله فليكن أول ما تدعوهم إليه شهادة أن لا إله إلا الله. Let the first thing you call them be the shahada of La ilaha illallah, the Tawheed of Allah, and so on. So the word was not unknown. And as we see, when we look at the early generations, Abu Hanifa rahimahullah ta'ala died 150 after the Hijrah. We see that this word Tawheed and even Tawhid al-Rububiyyah, Tawhid al-Uluhiyyah. These were words that were known to the people. They were not unusual to the people. And actually, to be quite honest with you, another argument you can make is that even عند الفرق الضالة, the misguided groups also use the word. They might use it for in a slightly different context, but they also use the same word as well. But that's just a little fa'idah for a benefit. So we spoke about the taqseem of Tawheed briefly, just to get, because we wanted to, really what I wanted to do is for you to be thinking about Tawheed al-Asma wa Sifat and where it fits in, and the fact of what is required from you to know Allah, to affirm who Allah Azza wa Jal is. So now, if we have understood that the issue of Tawheed being 3 or 2, and how those two are there, and that it's a reality in the Sharia. There's another question that a person could ask. And a person could ask regarding this taqseem al-Tawheed, a person could ask, is it not possible for someone to add another type of Tawheed? Before that, there's another issue I wanted to talk to you about. Before that, is there a need for Tawheed al-Asma wa Sifat? So we'll deal with that one, then we'll deal about another type of Tawheed after that. So is there a need for Tawheed al-Asma wa Sifat? Should we not, all of us, just go back to al-Ma'rifati wal-Ithbat? What's the need for it? In reality, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us that there is ilhad fi asma'ihi wa sifatihi. That there are people who practice deviancy with regard to Allah's names and attributes. وَلِلَّهِ الْأَسْمَاءُ الْحُسْنَى فَادْعُوهُ بِهَا وَذَرُوا الَّذِينَ يُلْحِدُونَ فِي أَسْمَائِهِ. Leave those who practice deviancy with regard to His names. And the examples of this deviancy are mentioned in the Quran. For example, the statement of Allah Azza wa Jal, وَإِذَا قِيلَ لَهُمُ اسْجُدُوا لِلرَّحْمَنِ قَالُوا وَمَا الرَّحْمَنِ أَنَسْجُدُ لِمَا تَأْمُرُنَا وَزَادَهُمْ نُفُورًا. In Surah Al-Furqan, ayah number 60. When it said to them, make sujood to Ar-Rahman, they say, we don't know who is Ar-Rahman. Where's the deviancy here? There are two types of deviancy here. The first one is that they denied Ar-Rahman. They denied it. This is ta'atil, right? They denied this name as belonging to Allah Azza wa Jal. قالوا وما الرحمن. And the way they said it is very, very, and they use the word ma as though it's, and as though we don't know what Ar-Rahman is. They didn't even say we don't know who. We don't know what Ar-Rahman is. Shall we make sajda to the one that you command us to? And it only increased them in turning away. The second is the hadith, or the athar, we should say. The athar, which explains the ayah, is that what they said is لا نعرف الرحمن إلا رحمن اليمامة. They say we only know the Rahman who lives in Yamama. And they said Saylima al-Kadhab, they were referring to him by it. So the point is here, look at this, they gave that name of Rahman to other than Allah Azza wa Jal. So that's an example of ilhad fi asma'illahi ta'ala. Likewise, in the statement of Allah Azza wa Jal, أَفَرَأَيْتُمُ اللَّاتَ وَالْعُزَّى. Have you not seen al-Lat and al-Uzza? What's the deviancy here? What's the ilhad here? In the names of Allah. Specifically, of course, taking idols and worshipping idols, that's in uluhiyyah. But what's the deviancy in the names of Allah here? Does anyone from the brothers who are with me know?
Change the names.
They changed the names of Allah and named their idols after them. So al-Uzza, they took the name of Allah, al-Aziz, and they named their idol after al-Aziz. And they said al-Lat is either from Allah or al-Ilah, that they they took out from these names for their idols. And this is also ilhad. So this example of ilhad, what does it tell us? It tells us that there is a need to single out the tawheed of Allah's names and attributes, because there is deviancy in it. There are people who are falling or are going astray. And we're not even talking, we're talking about the examples mentioned in the Quran. But if we come to the examples after that, if we come to al-Firaq al-Dala, the misguided groups and where they went, there are many examples. So there is a clear need, even within the ayat of the Quran, to single out Allah's names and attributes. What about adding other categories though? So what about if somebody says, can we not add a fourth category? Al-Mawdudi perhaps was one of the first people who added Tawhid al-Hakimiyya, as he calls it. And Shaykh Sadiq answered the question. But the first thing I wanted you to keep in mind is, we never said, I don't agree in the first place with this idea that Tawheed al-Asma wa Sifat was added on in the end. It's not added anyway, and it's something which is originally there in the Quran. So it's not being added anywhere. So that's the first thing. But as Shaykh Sadiq said in his answer, singling out Allah in his right to legislate is a part of al-Rububiyyah. And our ruling by what Allah has revealed is a part of al-Uluhiyyah. And not only that, but the name al-Hakam, Inna Allaha huwa al-Hakam wa ilayhi al-Hukm, and the name of Allah al-Hakim are the names, the two names which indicate Allah's right to legislate and to be worshipped by ruling by his, through ruling by his legislation. So those are already there in all three categories of Tawheed have issues of rulership and legislation in them. If we look at Allah's actions, Allah is the one who has the right to legislate. He sent down his Sharia and he made for every nation shir'atan wa minhaja, a way and a Sharia. If we look at our actions, وَمَنْ لَمْ يَحْكُمْ بِمَا أَنزَلَ اللَّهُ فَأُولَٰئِكَ هُمُ الْكَافِرُونَ. Those people who don't rule by what Allah has revealed, they are the disbelievers. Therefore, we are required to rule by Allah's law. Even though this here is kufr duna kufr, but that's a discussion for another day. This is Allah's law. So we're required to do that. And Allah tells us that He is Al-Hakim, and in the Sunnah, the Prophet ﷺ tells us that He is Al-Hakam. And that means that He, in His names and attributes, is the one who legislates and the one who has infinite wisdom in His legislation. So if something is present already in the categories of Tawheed, then you can't make it another category of Tawheed. That's the first point. Something that falls within the three categories can't itself be a category. Now, someone may say, hold on a second, and this is why I brought this here, not to just repeat what Shaykh Sadiq said, but because of a specific reason. Someone says, hold on a second, Muhammad Tim, you made a mistake there. Al-Asma wa Sifat falls within Rububiyyah. And you said you can't have Hakimiyyah because it falls within Al-Rububiyyah wal-Uluhiyyah wal-Asma wa Sifat. But actually, if you want to be really precise about it, Al-Asma wa Sifat and Al-Rububiyyah both come out of what? Knowing Allah and affirming who Allah is, Tawheed al-Ilmi. So it's not that Asma wa Sifat comes out of Rububiyyah. It's that either you divide it into knowing and acting, knowledge and action, in which case knowledge includes names and attributes and Rububiyyah, or you divide it into Rububiyyah, Uluhiyyah, and Asma wa Sifat. Each one of them has its own domain. Each one of them is clearly defined. Now, how do you add Hakimiyyah in there when Hakimiyyah is present in there and there and there? Does that make sense? You've lost your definition. You've lost your boundaries between the categories. Now, my second point here is that why specifically Hakimiyyah? why there are so many things that Allah Azza wa Jal does and that we are required to worship Him through and that are part of His names and attributes. Why do we not have 20 categories of Tawheed, 50 categories of Tawheed? Why can we not make a category of Tawheed about something else? What singles out this particular thing? There are so many acts of worship. There are so many names of Allah. And if someone says, oh, but there's kufr mentioned about this, فَأُولَٰئِكَ هُمُ الْكَافِرُونَ. There's also kufr mentioned about other things that are within the categories of Tawheed. So do we make 20, 10, 15, 30? It's غير منضبط. There's no precision in it. Also, another point. If we look at the ayat which mention Allah's right to legislate, are they mentioned the same way as His names and attributes are mentioned? For example, count the number, just let's start with a count. Count the number of ayat that mention the right of Allah to legislate or the right of the requirement of us to follow His legislation. And then count the number of ayat that mention His names and attributes. لا مقارنة. There's no way you can compare. Look at the way His names and attributes are brought together with worshipping Him and His lordship in one ayah. In Ayatul Kursi, in the first ayah in Surah Al-Fatiha, in the ayah in Surah Maryam, and you can keep going. I recommend a book. If you get a chance to have a look at it, there's a very nice book called al-Mukhtasar al-Mufid by Sheikh Abdul Razak al-Badr, Hafidhullah Ta'ala. Sheikh originally wrote a book called Al-Qawl al-Sadid في الرد على من أنكر تقسيم التوحيد. He wrote a book called Al-Qawl al-Sadid, refuting the people who say you shouldn't break up Tawheed into categories. But he later summarized it into Al-Mukhtasar al-Mufid, and it's very good. You can see there the ayat which gather all the types of Tawheed, the dua which gather all the types of Tawheed, the statements of the early scholars that gather all the types of Tawheed. But you just don't have those same ayat that gather all those things for al-Hakimiyyah, for example. You don't have it, like nowhere near. If you find one, you cannot find 20, 30, 40, 50 in the same way that you can find for al-Asma' wa Sifat. Furthermore, if you look at what the scholars of Islam said, are we now going to say that there was no need for this Tawheed until Al-Mawdudi came along? And nobody needed that Tawheed in all the... Mawdudi was here died in 1970 something, 1979 or something like that. And until the 1970s, 1960s, nobody needed Tawheed al-Hakimiyyah. Not one scholar of the past actually thought that this ummah needs this Tawheed until him. It doesn't make any sense, right? It's not like Tawheed al-Asma' wa Sifat. So then the question comes, why? Why single this out? And the answer can be found in a narration found in Sahih Muslim. أن الحرورية لما خرجت وهو مع علي بن أبي طالب رضي الله عنه قالوا لا حكم إلا لله قال علي كلمة حق أريد بها باطل. He said, there's a narration, Muslim narrated it and others, that when the Khawarij came out and they were along with Ali bin Abi Talib, they said, there is no ruling except for Allah. There is no right to rule except for Allah. Ali said something, wallahi, so profound. He finished the whole thing in one line. He said, kalimatu haqqin, what you're saying is true. Of course, ruling is for Allah. But what you want from this is something wrong. Ibn al-Qayyim has an amazing statement. I always remember it. I always tell it to the students in the Madrasatul Amariyah. He said, وَالِاسْتِلَاحَاتِ لَا مُشَاحَةَ فِيهَا مَا لَمْ تَتَضَمَّنْ مَفْسَدَةً. He said, there's no harm in terminologies. No one should be fighting each other over terminologies, as long as there's no negative consequences in it. So we see those people who added this extra category and said it's the same as al-Asma' wa Sifat. what did they really want? They wanted to do what the Khawarij did to Ali. They wanted to say, like the Khawarij said to Ali, La hukma illa lillah. They said, ruling is only for Allah. You're teaching Ali bin Abi Talib that ruling is only for Allah? He said, of course, ruling is only for Allah. Kalimatu haqqin urida biha batil. But you people want something from this. And what you want is takfir al-Muslimin, spilling the blood of the Muslims, making takfir of the Muslims, and so on. And so I mentioned this all here, even though it was already mentioned to you before in the Dawrah, because of the connection with al-Asma wa Sifat. Because people say that, this is the same as al-Asma wa Sifat, and they say, you people allowed an extra category to be added for Tawhid, al-Asma wa Sifat, but you're not allowing it to be added. You added al-Asma wa Sifat when there was a need, and we're adding this when there's a need. So inshallah ta'ala, and hopefully that has been understood and people have taken it on board. And the best answer is the answer of Ali bin Abi Talib. Kalimatu haqqin urida biha batil. We do not deny at all that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has the right to legislate, or that we have to rule by Allah's law, or that Allah Azza wa Jalla is al-Hakim al-Hakim. But what you people want from this is batil. You want evil from it. And what you want to use this as a stepping stone to do evil. And that's why we don't accept it. So let's step back. Before we go into a detailed discussion of the belief of Ahlul Sunnah with regard to the names and attributes, let's step back and talk about the purpose of creation. So when you think about the purpose of creation, what's the first ayah that comes into your mind since you've been doing the Dawrah? Surah Al-Dhariyat, right? Ayah number 56. وَمَا خَلَقْتُ الْجِنَّ وَالْإِنسِ إِلَّا لِيَعْبُدُونَ. I did not create the jinn or the men except to worship me, i.e. to worship me alone. لِيَعْبُدُونِ with the kasra on the end, and to worship me alone. That is Tawheed al-Uluhiyyah, and that's the reason why Allah created the jinn and why Allah Azza wa Jal created the men. But I also want you to keep in your mind another ayah. And this is the last ayah in Surah Al-Talaq. Allahu alladhi khalaqa sab'a samawati wa min al-ardi mithlahun yatanazzalu al-amru baynahunna lita'lamu anna Allah ala kulli shay'in qadir wa anna Allah qad ahata bi kulli shay'in ilma. Allah, the one who created 7 heavens, and from the earth the likes of them. His command descends between them, so that you may know that Allah is able to do all things and that Allah has encompassed everything with His knowledge. So Allah is telling us that He created the heavens and the earth for what reason? So that you know His names and attributes. Allah tells us that He created the heavens and the earth لِتَعْلَمُوا, for you to know. What to know what? أَنَّ اللَّهَ عَلَى كُلِّ شَيْءٍ قَدِيرٌ, that Allah is able to do all things. وَأَنَّ اللَّهَ قَدْ أَحَاطَ بِكُلِّ شَيْءٍ عِلْمًا, and that Allah has encompassed everything with His knowledge. Therefore, what we understood is that this ayah, what type of tawheed is the tawheed mentioned at the end in Surah Al-Talaq. Now I want you to be really precise about it. And if you're not precise about it, I'm going to tell you you're wrong. What tawheed is the tawheed mentioned? What's the focus? Sahih li ta'lamu, seeking knowledge, it can be a type of worship. But aside from that, the actual أَنَّ اللَّهَ عَلَى كُلِّ شَيْءٍ قَدِيرٌ وَأَنَّ اللَّهَ قَدْ أَحَاطَ بِكُلِّ شَيْءٍ عِلْمًا, what type of tawheed is this? Tawheed al-ma'rifati wal-ithbat. Yani it's al-rububiyyah and asma wa-sifat together. It's al-rububiyyah and asma wa-sifat together, because it deals with Allah's actions and Allah's attributes. So it tells us about His attributes and it tells us about His actions. So it combines between Tawheed al-asma wa-sifat and Tawheed al-rububiyyah. We can bring them together and call it Tawheed al-ma'rifati wal-ithbat. This Tawheed is one half of Tawheed, where the other half is Tawheed al-Uluhiyyah, which is mentioned in Surah Al-Dhariyat. That means that if you bring the ayah in Surah Al-Talaq, And the ayah in Surah Al-Dhariyat, you brought a complete understanding of the purpose of our existence on this earth. Surah Al-Dhariyat tells us that this existence is لِتَعْبُدُوا, and Surah Al-Talaq tells us that this existence is لِتَعْلَمُوا. So Surah Al-Dhariyat tells us it's for us to worship. وَمَا خَلَقْتُ الْجِنَّ وَالْإِنسَ إِلَّا لِيَعْبُدُونَ. And in Surah Al-Talaq, لِتَعْلَمُوا, so that you may know. And that shows us that Tawhid بِنَوْعِهِ, the two types of Tawhid, knowing Allah Azza wa Jal and affirming who Allah is, and then worshipping Him based upon that. And that's because there's no contradiction in the Quran. The Quran doesn't contradict itself. So here Allah Azza wa Jal tells us the heavens and the earth, the universe was created for you to know Allah. And in Surah Al-Dhariyat tells us that you were created to worship Allah. Put them together and you have a complete understanding of At-Tawhid. We were created to worship, and Allah Azza wa Jal created this universe, the heavens, the earth, and everything that's in it for us to know His names and attributes, and for us to know His actions, subhanahu wa ta'ala, which all comes together in the concept of Tawheed. Interestingly, you can add to that if you want, something like الَّذِي خَلَقَ الْمَوْتَ وَالْحَيَاةَ لِيَبْلُوَكُمْ أَيُّكُمْ أَحْسَنُ عَمَلًا. The one who created death and life for you to be tested, which of you is best in deeds. How do we bring this in? What are you tested in? The first thing you're tested in is Tawheed. The first and greatest test you'll ever be tested in is Tawheed. So you're going to be tested, are you going to single Allah out in worship or not? Are you making an effort to know your Lord or not?